Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of TIO Talks. I'm your host, Warwick Powell. Well, we're almost 3 weeks into 2026, and sometimes it feels like we've already lived 3 years or perhaps 3 decades. To get a handle on what's going on, I think we need to adopt a broad perspective, and that's why we have with us today Ali Borhani. Ali is a Persian Canadian who now resides in London, and many of you who've seen the show before will remember that Ali joined us last year to do a deep dive on the situation and the history of the conflicts in West Asia, particularly around Iran. Today's discussion is actually going to kick off from a piece that Ali published recently on his Substack, Future Early, and the links to that will be below. And in that, Ali focused on American interventions in Venezuela in particular and mused about what directions that might take and how Latin America itself may respond. In reading that piece, it made me think about how we have entered a period of incredible violence. Ali, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be with you, and thank you for having me back.
Technology these days is really underpinned by algorithms. Algorithms decide who watches what and when they get to watch things. That's the reality of the world today. But with your help, we can also help nudge the algorithm a little bit for our channel. In a world where information is more usually disinformation and cutting through the clutter becomes increasingly difficult, sharing news that you trust and liking information that you trust is actually central to getting the message out. So, if I could ask you to help us with a like and a subscribe and a share, that would be much appreciated. Thanks very much. Fantastic to see you. Your piece was incredibly provocative because it suggests that the United States, by way of intervening in Venezuela, in some regards has turned the table on the way that global geopolitics was meant to be configured. And I think back to 2001 after 9/11, when the global situation was framed in a way that suggested that the challenge facing nation states was the risks of non state actors. And your provocation actually suggests that, in fact, it may well be the United States that's going to write the next chapter of non state actor violence. Perhaps you can fill us in a little bit on the nature of that argument and what led you to think about the events in Latin America in this kind of way.
Well, thank you once again for having me back. I've been, looking as an observer, an analyst, a geopolitical strategist, as the contours of the world we're living in, and I've come to realize that the United States has a ballooning deficit, a budget deficit, and financial crisis, and ambitions as a hegemon. And there's a perhaps a delta and a discrepancy between the ambitions and the maintenance of the status quo and the hunger for prolonging this journey. And that brought me to think that AOK, many times in the Western Hemisphere, we look at the adversaries and say, oh, what they're doing is bad, what they're doing is wrong, and we're oblivion to our own handicaps, So then it all percolated, Warwick, that what stops United States to go rogue and to have the very characteristics that it calls out in context of particularly Russia and what you hear from Congress, what you hear from Senate. And then this all came to that, what is the showstopper for United States of, embracing a nation state like El Salvador. And, Nayib Bukele has been very well received in the White House as a strong man. And then this all came together that there is nothing, perhaps fantasy like if United States goes tomorrow with the likes of Blackwater Academy and the real Palantir and Eric Princes of the world, and says, hey, we need to create a Wagner group for Latin America. And you have 100,000 in incarceration, men under the age of 40, and the history of that, those gangs and, people and young people disenfranchised who are in these black holes is something for a different conversation. But then, hey, we electronically tag and monitor them, we train them, we make them hard battle, we provide them with swarm drones trainings and infiltration capabilities. And then, hallelujah, we create, not only a plausible deniability, but an outsourced mechanism for disrupting Latin America's course of integration or proximity or closer relationship with China. And in my opinion, this is more of a model in which United States could easily create what I say a cartel de las fantasmas, which is cartel of shadows and ghosts, and then to create enough of disruption that would challenge China's presence, whether it's in Chansay Port, whether it's in Panama Canal, whether it's in Latin America, for creating and increasing the cost of presence. Now, on the back of that, I have to say, I don't see in any form, shape, or fashion the Monroe Doctrine is something that United States is saying, I'm going to retrench from the rest of the world. I think we're moving from forever wars to wherever wars and whenever wars. I mean, already in this year, we've seen, kidnapping of a sovereign head of state, and, attacking, Nigeria and other countries. So I don't think the theater is shrinking. I think the model is changing, and basically, the first phase of outsourcing was in manufacturing, then call centers. I think now the chaos centers would be outsourced, and this is not something that America hasn't done and conducted in the past. It's just that the means of technology, crime, and I would say state and non-state convergence and technology, and the tech barons or tech bros can make this much more, real. So that was my observation in my piece.
Let's dive into that a little bit more, because this idea of the United States essentially building a proxy army, if you will, of activists has, of course, been part and parcel of American modus operandi for many, many decades. But what I thought was interesting about your piece is that it actually suggests that it might, in effect, formalize that as a standing reserve army comprised of the prisoners that had been incarcerated and trained and built up and all those things over many years, and from which it can now draw and release into the wild. You use the analogy of the Wagner Group, which of course eventually was folded into the Russian army proper. So in a sense, the prospects that you're describing is the United States, despite the fact that it's boosting its military budget to 1.5 trillion, is actually looking at mobilizing human fodder on the cheap.
I think a lot of this is correlated to the real hard facts of balance sheets and budget, and the dash for resources, and NIMBY, not in my backyard, is becoming a geopolitical thing. The problem with that is that the United States, is very high on the reach and the capacities and capabilities of technology. So a great part of the havoc that we see, whether it's Operation Spiderweb or whether it's hitting the residences of, President Putin, which has been in the headlines in the past few weeks, these are stretches of a technology, and the drones and the cyber elements. The tragedy is that many of these things have a boomerang effect, so a lot of these things come back in full circle in 5 to 10 years. And yes, in Latin America, the dash is for mineral resources and the bounties of lithium triangle to gold and to silver and all of that. The key question is, what can Latin American states do about this? And I think, with the exception of Argentina and a few elections here or there is this general spirit in Latin America that they don't want to be colonized. They don't want to be part of, as you rightly said, a cannon fodder for an imperial architecture. And there is a need for what I would say something similar to SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but between the Latin American countries. And the SCO, as you know, was just right after September 11 put together to deflect, drug trafficking, extremism, and terrorism. And when you look at Latin American characteristics, a great part of that could fit today for the very same needs in Latin America. Now, what I think is worth pondering is that, how can an electronic tagging monitoring of, these are part and parcel of penal reality and, and in the world of, incarceration, subdermal microchips, and, and these are people that have already been sadly written off the balance sheet of their societies. So there is not an audit as such per se that, hey, what happened to this 1,000 of M13 or, so and so gangs, because they're already been put in a black hole as such that, nobody knows their names. And that's why I call this, Cartel de los Fantasmas, of ghosts. And the cost of operating 10,000, 5,000, 7,000 hard battle trained, very well remunerated as such as well, that, hey, this is it, take it or leave it, can be far cheaper than mobilizing an air battleship, air carrier, and hovering around for billions around the continent to cause havoc. So, and then, modular, deniable, battlefield, electronic warfare, drone swarm logistics, cyber sabotage, intelligence infiltration. And then this comes all about resources. We know that the language is changing as well. So I see there is a pattern, Warwick. This is not just mobilization and alliance with a Latin American country that I'm musing and thinking that this may happen. I'm not trying to play a Cassandra here. I'm just saying we've seen this before, and technology accelerates that. But the decorum is gone as well. When President of the United States says that, another president in Latin America has to watch his ass just on air, or gives his finger and uses the F word on a heckler, we've lost the decorum. So this all is a pattern. There's a sense of entitlement that I put a chastity belt on any of you, allies or adversaries, but I have a polyamorous relationship with whichever nation I want, and I can take any soil, any country, anywhere I want, from Greenland to Panama Canal, renaming, asking technology companies to change the names of the waterways on Google Maps. So the technology sector is as well very much embedded in this direction. And if you look at the inauguration, the lineup of people, or the people who are at the moment running the rules of engagement in the United States, are that body that I say could be an instrumental set of actors in creating these new policies of, I would say, annexation, aggression, and engagement in various continents.
It seems to me that what you're trying to get at here, and I guess this is the challenge that many people are facing with the flux and the what at least on the surface of things appears to be so many incidents and events that disrupt the patterns that many have become accustomed to, is an ontology of a declining empire and the kind of the logic of violence that it is now adopting as part of the essence of its decline. So, in the years after the Second World War, the American military, as one of the poles, engaged in all sorts of wars around the world, explicitly so, whether it was in Vietnam or in Korea. It has troops all around the world. Its hundreds of bases are legion, right? And yet it seems to be doing two things at the same time. One is muscling up in terms of budget, but at the same time, it's actually starting to create a layer or a dimension of violence that is one step removed, an arm's length kind of capability that enables plausible deniability on the one hand, but also one in which it can wash its hands of responsibility, period. And we've seen this, I think, in Ukraine. We're seeing this in the Western Pacific, Asia, and to some extent, we see this also in West Asia and now in Latin America. Would it be fair to say that what your thinking is starting to peel away at or trying to get at is this essential ontology of the violence of empire's end?
I think we are moving from what I have heard for my adult life from neoliberalism and liberalism to neo-colonialism and neo-mercantilism and neo-militarism, but it's all manifesting in sadism as well, sadism, neo-sadism. And this is, the chicken is coming home to the roost. I mean, look at Europe at the moment, scrambling of how to address Greenland in 21st century, right? When you hear that, anti-coercion, initiative and act in France, anti-coercion instrument. So, so it's out there. So, and you're absolutely right, Warwick. America cannot afford to go into full-fledged wars with boots on the ground because for whatever the facts are, because it's ironic. United States. I heard this long time ago from an American guy, and he said our biggest asset is not our aircraft carrier; it's Madison Avenue. At the time, advertising companies were very important still, and developing narrative is fascinating. So the way even the MAGA base felt that, it was great. We got their oil, and now we have the guy in the bag, and he's in New York, Southern District Court, President Chavez. That is that, hey, in core of it, we don't mind if we can go out and grab, but on the cheap. We don't want to have body bags coming back. We don't want to have another $1 trillion of budget deficit. So the key question is how to maintain that, how to expand that, and how to go about a $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion of defense budget, while at the same time you hear China is looking at the world model in a different way, increasing the Belt and Road Initiative budget in 2025 by $213 billion. So these two models are coming head to head. There's finite resources, at least based on geological surveys of silver, copper, lithium, and the rest of it. And United States on a scramble to catch up on what I would say would be the choking of trade corridors, mineral corridors, energy, which is oil and gas, finance. And that is I would say, the recipe on how to retain, maintain, prolong the hegemony on the cheap.
Yeah, but there's a paradox in that in the end, because the on the cheap piece can sustain chaos, um,
Yes.
but it can't actually create the new order or re-establish the old order. And perhaps, in fact, the new modus operandi is to sustain as much disruption and chaos as possible in a kick the can down the road kind of way, in the hopes perhaps that others will be exhausted, or that miraculously the United States may stumble upon something. But in the meantime, let's just make sure that nothing new can be stabilized, um, just in case.
Yeah, I agree, but I also think that we sometimes forget, we sometimes forget to look at American society at its core. Lovely people, wonderful. I've many friends, American friends, and at times, yet I am blown away by how oblivion they are to the tragedies that are brewing in their own society. There's so much of talk right now around the world about human rights here, human rights there. Every year, on average, if you look at mapping police violence, anywhere from 1,200 to 1,500 die at the hands of US police. It's just mind boggling, right? So, just the past 5 years, it's roughly around 7,000 people. You look at ICE at the moment and what they do around the United States, but you don't see a beep from European Union and Brussels saying that we condemn what ICE is doing. We condemn, the killing of 1,500 people at the hands of American police. Um, so there is this element of, I would say, um, disproportionate sense of awareness about what's wrong at home. I had a wizard that helped me to learn a bit about meditation, and he said a lot of times people go to the mirror to wipe out a mark from their own face, but on the mirror. And that is what I feel this part of American posture and projection over the world historically has resulted in, that it's a continuous wiping on the mirror, which the stain is on its own face, on her own face. So the psychology of violence is something that I think is now finding financial constraints, and the world is starting to wake up and smell the roses, from Europe. I mean, today headline was that giving back Chagos Islands is, such a stupid and, silly decision by United Kingdom. And you just sit there and you realize that, hey, United States is a good 15,000 kilometers away from Diego Garcia. And if you want to go to Monroe Doctrine, why is it wrong to give back Diego Garcia and Chagos Islands to Mauritius? The reality is that US is not entrenching and retrenching, it's entrenching as a matter of fact, So I think this idea that we want to go back to Monroe Doctrine is a cover. Part of the challenge, and I'll stop in a minute, is that and there's an element of, I would say, tactical deception and strategic aggression. That United States is now talking about dialogue and negotiations on one side, but that is a cloak for aggression and a punch. So the trust
But
is eroding.
other than its own population, who's it fooling?
Well, I think I always say, you fool me once, shame on you. You fool me twice, shame on me. You fool me in perpetuity, shame on humanity. And apparently, I think that the United States has got away with this since, the fall of Berlin Wall in 1991, in a unipolar world, to build up the narrative. And Europe, to a great extent, finds itself in pickles. I mean, it's on display every day, from Berlin to London to Paris to Brussels. There is no agency, so it's very humiliating to come out and say we were fooled. Because now all of a sudden you're without energy security, you're without military security, and tomorrow morning, I don't think that it would be far fetched that this saber rattling can lead to asset seizures and sanctions and many other elements. The way Trump is playing, that Europe will find some of the very things that it has seconded and supported in U.S. foreign policy will be applied to the continent itself.
Well, the European situation is an interesting one, right? Because in many ways they've had to sustain the myth of the Kool Aid, and because it mean to do otherwise would be to admit something, but at the same time, keeping a lid on the myth and sustaining that in the face of unfolding economic and social hardship and realities from the population writ large becomes increasingly difficult. And the same thing I think is happening in the UK, where you are, and we see this in part in the polling numbers, insofar as the standing of respective national leaders are concerned. But secondly, also the bubbling, the ferment that seems to be brewing across civil society and in various parts of Western Europe and also in the UK, which evinces a deep sense of disconnect between those who are seeking to sustain the myth and those who've seen through it.
I couldn't agree more with you, but the emperor has no clothes. I think the packaging has come off, the ribbon is off, and the box looks rather very intimidating. What we find in it, and it's out there for this on the display. There is no denial. There is not like America may do this or America may do that. The language, as I said, the decorum is gone, and part of the challenge, I think, is um, everything is fair game for United States today. Then that begs the question: what next? That begs the question: how these crises can escalate, and what are the ramifications? And as I said, the energy, minerals, finance is coming to clash with ideology, and the ideology is that the one who can do no wrong, I can do anything, and no rules apply to me. So it's a great power land grab,
So, so
and in
let's explore a scenario, Ali. The most obvious one at the moment is Greenland, and it's obviously the source of considerable anxiety amongst the Europeans themselves. It goes to the heart of NATO. It goes to the heart of what supposedly holds the whole transatlantic political West together. What if, in the next week or so, the United States landed 5,000 to 10,000 troops on Greenland, took control of the three or four major airports and seaports, and said, it's ours? What happens then?
Well, I think Europe would like to think that they have a recourse. I'm afraid that they don't. And the first game there is that United States, if it really wants to play hardball, we're still in January. And
That's right.
if you're talking about next week,
Well, it's not
United.
far, right? So it would be probably a 2 week preparation, maybe 3 weeks, and you would literally have the ships there. It's not hard, let's put it this way: there are 55, 56,000 people on Greenland. The United States already has a military base there. Um, so um, it can all happen very quickly. Um, and so, and if it did happen very quickly, uh, what next? What does Brussels do? What are the options that it has available, and what does it mean in terms of the mythology of the political West?
I think that is already shattered. That is already, in my opinion, in a crystal bowl, when you have hot and cold water, when the moment the fracture starts, next time you put a little bit of hot water or cold water, it will crack. So the cracks are there. We're in denial. I mean, Kaya Kalas and the rest are just in denial. And United States can play very hardball here, Warwick. Tomorrow morning, if they say, bugger off, we're not going to send you LNG, and Nord Stream is cut as well, freezing cold, then it brings the Europeans back to their senses. And when we talk about Europe, Europe is not, homogeneous, all same thing. Hungary is different. Some certain Poland is different. The key question is, when will Europe realize? I wrote another piece, as a matter of fact, now that you're raising this, and it reminded me of a piece I wrote as a new prescription for Europe. And my recommendation was that the European safety is in a harmonious Eurasian architecture. And a non aggression pact with Russia would be the first step. The second step is to revitalize energy security and diversifying energy security, not just relying on United States. Tomorrow morning, United States, if uses its famous kill switch on, F-35s and F-16s, half of them European, squadrons are grounded. These are realities, and if they don't send them, material based on the NATO kit, it's a what do you call, a continent with very little agency at the moment. Yes, there are startups of drone companies in Germany, and everybody's excited, and Rheinmetall, but no, this is not a recipe for success at the time and age we're living. The key question is, what does that leave from a psychology of credibility of European continent? And that is where I think, for maybe another talk, we should talk about civilizational states, ideological states, nation states, and manufactured states. And I think in that context, which one is Europe? How many civilizational states are on European continent? How many of them are manufactured states? How many of them are nation states? And can a continent be an ideological state at the expense of many of its constituents and nationalities who no longer agree, subscribe, or see the necessity of making sacrifices when the rule book is like a jungle?
It seems that there's a real disjuncture, though, between the elite class that have emerged over the course of the last 35 years and have developed, fine-tuned their skills as operatives within the context of an American-dominated Western unipolar era, and all of that's falling apart now. That so that's one hand. The second bit, though, is as it falls apart, the circumstances on the ground begin to tell,
Mhm.
and it seems to me, in any case, that whilst the moment hasn't yet arrived, that the dynamics are in place now, and perhaps an intervention on Greenland might be the trigger that really drives that wedge, not between the United States and the European elite, but between the populations of Western Europe and the elite in Brussels. And it's at that moment where the serious European fractures start to emerge.
I couldn't write that off in any form, shape, or fashion. The key question is, what's in it for United States? United States has to prolong the dependency of European Union on Washington for years to come, on energy, on defense, and the rest of it. Um, I genuinely believe that, I used to advise many years ago hospitality companies and hotel industry, part of the growth and strategy. And I always came across two models in hospitality. You have asset light model and asset heavy. In an asset light, you have operators like the Four Seasons of the world, the Mandarin Orientals, who are the operating companies. The asset owner is somebody else, and the asset owner gives the operating model to these companies.
Yeah.
I think United States today is like an asset owner that is getting rid of the hotel managers, but at the same time would like to claw as much of the real estate in and around the hotel as well for itself. And then to create a quasi model, which is not far fetched. I said that in the era of Trump, the State Department was replaced by Real Estate Department, and and that is part of the mindset. I need land, I need resources, I need to control the chokeholds of trade and corridors and minerals. And Europe, sadly, neither has the financial capacity to buy back some of these assets, nor find it's relevant in the operating model today to retain some of those agreements and contracts. So it's being booted out.
Well, which again leads me to the question, which is that there's many parts of Europe. So there's an elite in Brussels. There
And no,
are
no, they're all in Davos today.
They're in Davos today. There are political elite in national capitals, most of whom are deeply intertwined with those in Brussels. Then there are national opponents at a political level, at an organized political level, in some countries more than others. And then there are a whole bunch of the unwashed masses, so to speak, whose lives seem to be increasingly immiserated. When you put all of that together, it seems that what we're entering into is actually a period of social violence, right? That
Mhm.
could give rise to increasing violence from the state. And we're seeing that in terms of the violence to stop voices, whether it's Jacques Board from Switzerland and others who've been sanctioned by the EU, or the turning of the local police on local demonstrators. And the circumstances in the political West, the transatlantic ecosystem, seems to be one that is deeply violent in just about every respect. So it's not just an American violence, which has been obviously a focal point of our discussion today, but it seems perhaps that this is a violence of a Western project that's coming apart.
I'd like to invite you to go back to the time of Gilets Jaunes and the protests in Paris, and how many people lost their eyes. And you don't. We have become somewhat, I would say, sadly, the irony is here that we're talking about people who lost their eyesight and vision. We've become blind to our own handicaps. We've been lecturing the rest of the world and rather oblivion to our own fault lines. And I think you're absolutely right. But I find this ever more profound in the United States, to be honest with you. I think there is this growing threat that United States is becoming a very polarized society. I mean, the scenes that you see in various cities of confrontation, people being stopped because they have an accent. I mean, it's just mind-boggling that you're being harassed as a citizen because you have an accent. And Americans have forgotten that when they arrived on that soil, or as colonizers or occupiers, they had an accent comparing to the native people as well. So where does this buck philosophically stop? But looking at where we are today, I think United States' biggest threats are within, and this is not by external actors and foreign elements. No, I mean, if you remember Timothy McVeigh and Oklahoma City tragedy, there is a lot of disorientation in American society, and with today's convergence of many of these I would say, social, cultural, socio political, socio economical disorientations and frustrations, and the convergence of technology and drones and the rest of it. God may save all of us from any of these disoriented, frustrated ruptures at the social level in any capital anywhere in the world. So this idea of expending trillions and billions of dollars overseas, yet forgetting about the home, can cause massive social rupture and frustration and aggression at home. And that is very dangerous, Warwick. I couldn't agree more with your assessment.
Now, you drew an interesting contrast between the $1.5 trillion defense budget coming from the Pentagon versus the Belt and Road Initiative. But I wanted to stick with the situation in the political West a little bit more. And before we hit the record button earlier, you were talking to me about some situations in London itself in terms of the uh, the the erosion of economic safety, or put it the other way, the exacerbation of a form of economic violence as a result of budgetary decisions
Mhm.
concerning foundational infrastructure. And we're
Yep.
talking about water.
Yep.
Um, uh, that's just another example, it seems to me, of a polity that has lost its sense of grounded priorities in preference to hectoring and also in preference to prosecuting and externalizing violence itself. But there is an internal contradiction now that is starting to come to the surface in ways that are almost impossible to brush under the carpet.
Couldn't agree more with you. I read a few weeks ago in reputable journals and broadsheets that there are plans to evacuate 1.5 million people from Canary Wharf if the pumping station there fails. And you just sit there and you say, this is the heart of financial capital and heart of London. Then water bottles being distributed in some cities outside of London because the water stations have failed. And then when you go and look at it, it's all acquired by American private equity firms and hedge funds. And the social contract is fascinating when you go and do an audit. And the capital expenditure as well. I mean, HS2, which is a white elephant, from 35 billion to 132 billion pounds, and still not finished, not even 100 kilometers. So the key question is that for so long you can drag your deliverables and say blame it on this, blame it on that. The rude awakening is that when you have to wake up and say, oh my God, America is going to swallow Greenland and we are part of Europe, we're not part of Europe, how are we going to react? And when the prime minister is put on spot, he says, oh, I have to refer to international law and see if this is okay or not, and America's interpretation of it, So people after a while start saying, what the hell is this? How is all of this add up and tally? I don't have water. I have to get bottled water. I'm looking at the capacity of infrastructure and the rest of it. Why am I paying these taxes for what? For what returns? And this causes, of course, disorientation. And you see far right populist parties rising and saying, "We will make it happen. We will bring everything back to, the glorious days." And we've seen the result of that in United States. I think it was Antonio Gramsci, the theorist and journalist, who said the old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. I'm afraid
Yes.
that it's a scary time we're living, Warwick.
Ali Borhani, thank you for joining me today in this incredibly wide ranging survey of the landscape. We're literally 3 weeks into 2026. And as I said at the outset, it feels like maybe 3 years and sometimes 3 decades. The underlying message, I guess, that I take away from this is that we are in a period of incredible flux, much of which is manifesting itself or embodying itself in all sorts of violent turns, whether it's the violence of militaries, the violence of paramilitaries, the violence of economic infrastructure decaying, or the violence of words themselves. I look forward to having you back again in the not too distant future, Ali, where we can dissect the ongoing evolution of this changing world. Thanks again for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Hey, everybody. Spreading the news and getting the message out is really a community effort. I'd really appreciate it if you could like, comment, or subscribe, and subscribe, in fact, to the channel It would really help give the algorithm a nudge along. Thanks very much.